Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. We've had two wonderful talks giving a lot of hands-on examples of the kind of stuff that multinational corporations do and our inability to contain them. So I had a title for my talk which was basically about the monster of the multinational corporation and how to tame it. And even though we're up against a big, very forceful, powerful enemy which has access to all sorts of political, legal, financial resources, nevertheless, I have the impression that we're now in the midst of a window of political opportunity which provides us with the best chances to tame this big monster that we had in a long time. And that is basically how I'm going to finish and conclude. So you know that at the end of my quite somber talk, there will be some sort of uplifting insights which have to do with the political window of opportunity in which we currently are. It's a big monster. It's an old monster. It dates from the 17th century. It is the large, anonymously held, publicly quoted corporation. But still, the way in which it has developed dates back from the late 19th century. Before the late 19th century, large publicly quoted limited liability corporations needed to have a mandate from the state, basically a license to operate which was granted to them by the state in order to do the stuff that they were set up, established to do. And it's only from the beginning of the 20th century that they started, some of them at least, become to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, even bigger than basically a lot of national political economies in terms of GDP compared to the balance sheet sizes of some of these corporations. But or better, our politicians have allowed them to become the monsters that they have turned into in the late 20th, early 21st century due to this process of deregulation, liberalization and privatization. So actually, in response to what can be seen as the crisis of the Fordist Keynesian welfare state, which dominated countries in Europe as well as in North America in the 3 glorious decades after the Second World War, in response to the crisis of that particular system, we came up with only one answer, and the answer was liberate the large corporation, and the large corporation will give us wealth and jobs. And initially it seemed to work. It seemed that indeed these liberated corporations conquering the earth provided us here in Europe and in North America with what we wanted: large television screens and in particular jobs, large automobiles, etc., etc. And especially from the perspective of the firms themselves, this particular period lauded in big commercial and economic successes for corporations. And since they were so successful, also in terms of their legitimacy among the wider public, both as consumers and as employees, they had a large say in the way in which we've actually established markets, designed markets, consumption and production markets, since the late 70s, early 80s. It is pretty obvious if you look at what happened since the late 70s and early 80s that the process of market integration, which is at the heart of a lot of neoliberal programs, that the process of market integration was whispered to policymakers by large corporate interests, big banks and big firms. Basically, they have succeeded in allowing us They have succeeded in getting politicians and voters so far as to support a process which has actually resulted in creating a world which served mainly the interests of large publicly quoted corporations. And the effects have been all around us. I take an example from the country that I know best, the Netherlands. In 2000, the Dutch government had a budget of 200 billion euros. Of that 200 billion euros, 10%, 20 billion euros, was paid for by corporations, profit taxes. 13 years later, the Dutch state has an overall budget of 300 billion euros, but the submission of large corporations in terms of profit taxes is merely 4%. And this is partly caused, of course, by the halving of the overall taxation rates from, let's say, 50% to 22.5% currently in the Netherlands, nominal tax rates. And this is a process that has happened not only in the Netherlands, but throughout the developed world. Corporations have succeeded in paying less and less in terms of the overall reparation, management, maintenance of the material and immaterial infrastructure on which they rely to such a huge extent. We also, in Europe, have had this wonderful European integration project, which, right after the Second World War, was meant to bring peace and prosperity to European citizens. But we have witnessed this particular wonderful utopian, idealist project to become hijacked by large corporations and big banks, generating sufficient amounts of political resources by those very same big firms to influence, again, politicians to pursue particular kinds of policy programs. And again, it's deregulation, privatization, and liberalization, which predominantly serve their interests. Oh yeah, on the side they also generated jobs. In terms of taxation, we see a process of a race to the bottom. Similar kind of processes are happening in terms of employment protection. We see in Europe currently a process going on which is basically similar to what happened in the field of taxation. It is, again, a race to the bottom. Large corporate interests have succeeded in diminishing employment costs, not only in terms of the legal costs linked to employment protection, but also in terms of wages. And I don't need to go into any detail with regard to environmental issues. The story is basically the same. Large corporations, large banks, large firms have succeeded in creating a world which largely serves their interests. And up until the crisis, 2008, we had the impression, and we now know that it had been an illusion, we had the impression that even though a lot of stuff was going on with which we didn't agree, for instance, the kind of stuff that Shell was doing in Nigeria, across the board, our life chances, the degree of prosperity to which we had access was increasing, so we didn't really bother about what was happening. Except, of course, for a couple of people who were linked one way or the other to SOMO and other NGOs who did care about what was going on. Linked to this is a group of people which possessed a particular kind of expertise, who had a particular kind of training, who provided the stories which backed up the policy making, which again served the interests of big banks and big business. It is quite striking that within economics, after the Second World War, we have seen a process of increasing homogenization in terms of the kind of paradigms to which they subscribe. In the UK, in France, and basically in all other national academic cultures, there used to be a wide variety of different kind of economic paradigms. They have disappeared. Marxian, heterodox, political economists in places like the United Kingdom have disappeared to geography departments. And it's pretty obvious if you look at the academic hierarchy that geography is not on top of the social sciences. It is mainstream orthodox economics. And within orthodox economics, the story is a story about, in the beginning there were markets, and markets were good. They allocated goods, capital, labor and services in an efficient, optimal way. And the state, well, the state only has a role to play if there are evident, self-evident market failures. But of course, within the definition of mainstream neoclassical economics, there were only a small subset of market failures. So basically, the state should get out of the way of large business, etc., etc. Those storytellers, ladies and gentlemen, are crucially important because capitalism as such drives on romance. It drives on stories. It convinces us through the stories that are being told. And it's pretty obvious that if you run up against a battalion of economists with all that fancy mathematics, you feel humble and you feel humbled and you have a big fight to try to wage vis-a-vis this big battalion of mathematically trained economists. Okay. So this is what happened. A monster, and the monster was unleashed, and the unleashing of the monster took place with our support, and we were all blinded, not by science, but by stories which were told by a particular kind of cadre. The cadre that was trained on mainstream universities, including the University of Amsterdam as well as the University of Utrecht. And then there was this crisis, and it actually is a big crisis. We recently got a report from Standard & Poor's. The Netherlands got a report from Standard & Poor's, and it downgraded the Netherlands, like they did with France. We lost our AAA, and in that report it was stated that they expected the Netherlands to reach the level of wealth that it had in 2008 in 2017 only, which suggests 9 years of prosperity losses. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a bigger loss in wealth than happened in the Big Depression in the 30s. In the Big Depression in the 30s, the Netherlands reached the level of 2009 much quicker than it's now going to do in 2017. So it's a big crisis. And a big crisis as such, like it did in the 30s, opens up a window of opportunity of rethinking the way in which we have set up our economies and the way in which we have allowed the players in those economies to serve their interests. Crises are a window of opportunity to come up with new narratives, new storylines which might provide hope for citizens in Europe and across the globe. But it's not happening. Colin Crouch, a British sociologist, has written a wonderful book with an even more wonderful title, which is The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. And that is something that is sort of very clearly visible if you only read the papers on a sort of day-to-day basis. Neoliberalism doesn't die. It is like a cat. It seems to have 9 lives. How can that be? This is a big crisis of financialized capitalism. It should delegitimate, discredit the narratives that have been told in order to pursue the programs, the political programs of neoliberalization. And it doesn't happen. Why is that? One big explanation for that, of course, is the lack of alternatives. We've done all sorts of other stuff the last 15 years. In the Netherlands, we have endlessly debated multiculturalism, integration issues, the degree to which Islam is combinable with our rule of law, etc., etc. And we didn't pay any attention to what happened in financial markets, in banks, and in other economic markets. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that neoliberalism as such shields a capitalist reality or veils a capitalist reality, which is basically, and let's be honest about that, monopoly capitalism. Most of the markets that really matter on a global scale are dominated by 2 to 3 large multinational corporations. They have immense political clout. It has nothing to do with free market economics. This is using your blackmailing power in order to ensure that your interest will be maintained. Which also means that you want to get rid of all sorts of upstarts. The incumbents rule the markets. But that particular capitalist reality is fueled by this free market utopia. Neoliberalism tells a story about our economies as if we're dealing here with markets which are not dominated by large multinational corporations, but are sort of nice, neat, petty bourgeois-like markets in which small and medium-sized enterprises compete with one another, and no small and medium-sized enterprise is so powerful that it can basically put the market at its hands. They can't do that. That is the sort of storyline that is still being told by neoliberalism. And since we have no alternative story, we're still sort of seduced by that particular romance. And that means, at the end of the day, that large corporations still rule the roost. The examples that I know best come out of banking. It is amazing to see that the Netherlands is not only one of the largest tax havens worldwide, but it's also one of the largest. It's one of the largest markets in shadow banking. The Financial Stability Board, which was mandated by the G20 to try to describe what is going on in shadow banking, and shadow banking, for your understanding, is non-bank lenders who undertake bank-like activities, which basically means that we're dealing here with banks who are not regulated because they're not banks. And hence they don't have a banking license and they don't need a banking license, but they do all the other stuff that banks do. And in hindsight, they're seen to have been hugely involved in the channels of contagion which brought a US mortgage crisis to the Netherlands, to France, to Germany, to the United Kingdom, etc., etc. Basically, the interbank market works through shadow banking. And the Netherlands is the third largest market in shadow banking. The Financial Stability Board published a report in November 2012 which illustrated that. And what does the Dutch financial elite do? It downplays the size. So it tries to determine, okay, yeah, in a sort of aggregate way, we're big. But what is actually shadow banking is much smaller. So the guys from the Financial Stability Board simply don't know what they're talking about. So go to sleep, all is nice and quiet, we will take care of it. That is the way in which the banking sector, the financial elite in the Netherlands responds. And the same is true with banking. We have this Basel III sets of rules which are meant to ensure that our banks have sufficient capital in order to absorb shocks. But what happens in Basel III is basically a public consultation round. So the bankers, the central bankers of the Basel Committee of Bankers Supervision, put a document of 15 pages on the internet, and they ask parties who are one way or the other interested in this to come up with all sorts of comments on that 15-page document over a period of, let's say, 6 to 7 months. And I've looked at that, and if you look at the submissions, 267 submissions, all of them come from players in the financial services. There are no NGOs, there are no labor unions, there are no political parties, a handful of academics, most of them finance professors. So it's the industry itself which decides upon the rules that are meant to preclude the same industry to make, again, such a big mess of our reality. This is what is happening. Some, of course, put their hope of regulating big banks, the monster, in the European institutions. And I'm quite skeptical about that. Here in the Netherlands, the Green Left sees European coordination and European regulation as the only way to tame the monster of big banks and big corporations. But if you look more closely at what is happening in the European Union and the kind of legislation that is in the sausage machine of law producing, it is pretty obvious that it is filled to the brim, within its DNA, with basically the same set of assumptions, the worldview that is a neoliberal worldview at core. If you talk with civil servants in the European Commission about corporate governance, it's pretty obvious that the only set of legislation that is coming out of that particular commission is trying to enhance the transparency of annual reports in order to ensure that shareholders make better decisions. But shareholders are not going to save us from the monster of the large corporation. So I'm quite skeptical. Finally, to end with a more optimistic note. As I indicated, capitalism needs stories in order to be legitimate. And the legitimation of capitalism, to a huge extent, depends on whether it delivers the goodies. And what is quite striking about what happens and is happening since the crisis is that it does no longer deliver the goodies. In the Netherlands, the average consumption power of households is now at the same level as 1997. So we've become poorer over the last couple of years. It doesn't deliver the goodies. And the kind of policies that have been pursued before the crisis, wage moderation linked with no taxation for corporations, basically means that all the taxation that is required in order, again, to do the maintenance of our material and immaterial infrastructure has to be paid out of the production factor of labor. This combination of burdening households with paying the full share of taxation and decreasing wages for an increasing number of people, as well as the kind of troika policies that are pursued in the European periphery, namely getting rid of employment protection measures at all across the board, means that the legitimacy of capitalism is now at stake. And it is no coincidence that on the back of the crisis, a business newspaper like the Financial Times had a long series under the heading, "The Crisis of Capitalism." So what I see happening in the next couple of years is that, again, we will see the arising of Henry Ford-like people among the capitalists themselves. For your recollection, Henry Ford, the car maker in the 20s and 30s, quickly found out that if he didn't pay his workers sufficient amount of wages, there was no one who's going to buy the cars. And we're in the midst of a big underconsumption crisis in Europe, which means that increasingly large firms also will rediscover the need for them to pay, first of all, their fair share of taxation and pay fair wages to all their workers wherever they are. And that, of course, means that at the end of the day, NGOs like SOMO have cut their work out for them, and they can ride this wave. And false politicians were still sort of blinded and seduced by the older narrative of neoliberalism to open their eyes and see that there is only one way to make capitalism work for citizens again, and that is tame the monster of the large multinational corporation.